So, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Today we are going to be talking about the new first generation homebuyer community DPA fund. So, for a quick agenda today, we are going to look at a little bit about how I always start every meeting. What are the benefits of having best practices? We're going to talk a little bit about the approach of why first generation. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the product terms and uses and how they relate to the best practices. We're going to have a conversation a little bit about implementation, some of the opportunity with this pilot, and then I would love to hear from you, either questions throughout the presentation or as we come towards the end, I'd love to hear from you about how you are thinking about the launch of this program and how it might impact some of the work that you are doing around down payment assistance. So just to start briefly, I always like to highlight a little bit about the best practices. So the best practices were launched a little over a year ago. And as a reminder, the best practices were developed by a cross-sector working group of subject matter experts as kind of the first step towards improving the down payment ecosystem. The benefits of having best practices for down payment assistance include promoting standardization, removing barriers for consumers. We often hear about how challenging it is to access down payment assistance, get approved, etc. We are also believe that having best practices will help increase the investment in down payment. It helps to create a pathway forward and legitimize current programs, as well as the argument for increasing investment in current and new programs. Also, it's an opportunity, the best practices, to look at ways to make sure that down payment assistance is reaching those who need it the most and those who have been left out of the opportunity of homeownership. And then finally, there is an opportunity around developing these best practices that have brought us together about every other month to kind of talk about the best practices and other things impacting down payment assistance in our market. And I think this is a good step towards beginning to build coalition broadly. So a little bit about kind of the origins and why how we got here today with the first generation homebuyer community DPA fund, which I'm just going to shorthand and start calling First Gen Community Fund. So essentially, this began in 2020, and the center developed a strategic plan and really thought about what can we do with more intentionality to help close the racial homeownership gap. So this was in 2018, 2019, a lot of conversation being had, trying to figure out, what we could do to be bold in this space and really make an impact. So some of the things that came out of that strategic plan was this idea, again, to have more contribution to closing the racial homeownership gap in our state, and how might we use down payment assistance to support that goal. So in 2021, the Minnesota Homeownership Center, along with the Minnesota Realtors, released a study called Quantifying the Need for Down Payment Assistance. And essentially, this study called out the impact of down payment and what it could do to essentially reduce the racial homeownership gap, and really called out the impact of not having generational wealth through homeownership. So as a result of our strategic plan and this study, the center established a cross-sector DPA working group of 16 stakeholders. So out of that working group came a lot of things. It also came kind of an advocacy agenda in terms of how might we get the state to invest in down payment and assistance, and how might we do it in a way that helps us reach those who have been left out. So the Minnesota Homeownership Center, Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity, and the Minnesota Realtors got together behind some advocacy and went to the legislature and made this ask for first generation down payment assistance. We were not successful, but we did actually land in a bill that was not funded. And we got a lot of buy-in, and we got a lot of support across the aisle, and we expanded the advocacy collaboration to go to 26 supporting organizations. So kind of based on this success and our progress, we then went back to the legislature in 2023, and we were successful in securing a $100 million appropriation for this first gen community fund. At the same time, Minnesota Housing also received a $50 million appropriation, and they have a separate program that they are providing training and information on and is available at their website. So this is kind of how we got to where we are on the funding points, and it really was really strongly rooted in collaboration. And one of the main contributors of the success of these dollars being appropriated was the kind of cross-sector, across the aisle collaboration and support and advocacy for these funds. So why first gen? So again, kind of getting back to how might we use down payment and assistance as a way to narrow the racial homeownership gap in our state? So we have had down payment assistance in our market for many years. Many of you have been operating programs and supporting programs for a very long time. It's definitely one of the reasons why we have one of the highest rates of homeownership in this country. I think the last time I checked, we were in the top 3. But it also has contributed to disparities in our state. And as you know, we have some of the highest disparities, particularly between Black and white homeownership. So the proxies that down payment have used for many, many years, which include first-time homebuyer and low to moderate income, have continued to leave many out of homeownership. So as we thought about this, and some of the municipalities were doing this work, and there was some research being issued on the idea and the concept of first generation, we felt that this was a good approach to getting investment of state dollars, one that would be accepted and understood. This idea that if you have never had anyone own a home and have not benefited from the generational wealth that comes out of home ownership, that you are at a disadvantage. And the understanding that there were many practices in place that legally kept people out of this opportunity. And so it was supported, it was easily understood, and we were able to get this through. And we're very excited about this opportunity. And I also feel like I just need to call out that this is a pilot. And so while we believe this is going to be an effective way, we don't know yet. We needed a starting point. So when we went to the legislature, this is where we started. If we find that this program is not successful and the majority of the households that are reached do not represent communities that have been left out of homeownership, we are likely to try a new strategy. So also just calling out in this, and some of what I'm going to talk about today, is that the secondary kind of benefit or goal of this program, in addition to texting this proxy, is this idea of implementing the best practices. When we were designing this program, having the best practices established really helped us create buy-in and have a foundation for which to build the program. So we're going to talk a little bit about eligibility. And as we go through this, I'm going to kind of call out what is in alignment with best practices. So the definition of first generation borrower, it's really important that we help people understand what this means. It's a new concept, and from the training we've had and the conversations that we're having with industry and consumers, it's very clear that there's a lot of confusion around what it means to be a first generation home buyer. And if you couple that with the idea that depending on some programs, they define this a little differently, it's added even more confusion. So for this program, for the First Generation Community Fund, essentially it's that the borrower and their parent or legal guardian have never owned a home in any country, and the only exception is if they owned a home and they lost it to foreclosure. So I think the part that people are struggling with is this idea of did I actually benefit from my parents' ownership? And so we've had a lot of questions about Well, what if my parent married someone who owns a home? Am I a first generation buyer? What if only one of my parents owned a home? Am I a first generation buyer? And the answer to both of those is no. And what we're going to be working on over the next few weeks is trying to get this communication out through marketing and outreach to help people understand if they qualify. So essentially, moving towards language like if any one of your parents at any time owned a home, you are not a first generation buyer, regardless of whether or not that parent or guardian is alive. And if any of your parents or legal guardians, including yourself, married someone who owns a home, you had ownership interest in a house and you are not a first generation borrower. So this is something that you're going to be hearing a lot about. And as once we get these messages out into community, we would ask that you would help carry this message and help people understand what it means to be a first generation buyer. So in the best practices, we name that targeted assistance, that one way to do targeted assistance is either through first generation borrower or using a race specific criteria. So everything that's kind of bolded in green aligns with best practices. We also encourage that DPA programs at a minimum limit it to first-time home buyers. So for this program, while only one borrower needs to be first generation, any co-borrower has to be at least a first-time home buyer with no ownership interest in the last 3 years. And we are using self-attestation, which we also recommend in the best practices, and they will be signing an affidavit. So again, kind of thinking about the best practices, some of these approaches are a disruption to the way things have been done historically. But when we developed the best practices, we were really thinking about what is in the best interest of the consumer and what is going to simplify this and help them be successful in home ownership. So one of the key tenets to the best practices is ensuring that homebuyer education is happening early in the process. And so for this program, in order to apply, you have to have completed homebuyer education, an approved course, within the last year. And also, that education needs to be completed before you apply and before purchase agreement. So another best practice that we call out is the idea of using borrower income. Many down payment assistance programs use household income, and depending on the funding source, that could be the reason why. But for many who even have flexible funding, the use of household income is just based on a historical practice and some beliefs around who should be eligible and who really needs the funds. So what we have encouraged is that if your funding source allows it, that instead of using household income, that you actually use borrower income. Having two different income calculations, borrower versus household, leads to a lot of confusion for all parties. And often household income is not representative of who is responsible for paying the mortgage. When you use household income, it could include an elderly parent's Social Security, a young adult working on launching who might just be home for a year or two, but both parties who are unlikely to be responsible for a 30-year mortgage. So sometimes the counter argument to using borrower income is that, well, what if they don't include a spouse or a partner on the mortgage? And while that is allowable, given the market and the cost of housing, it's unlikely for most, and it's a huge drawback because it's going to limit their purchase price significantly. So while that is a possibility, it's not what we see as a trend. And so we believe that borrower income accurately represents who's responsible for the mortgage and is what should be used, which also then lends to this idea that you can use lender qualified income to determine eligibility. So for this program, we will be using borrower income, and lender income will be used to determine eligibility. The DPA lenders will not be duplicating the work of collecting income, and instead they will be relying on the 1008. And so, again, this is new practice and it makes some uncomfortable, but lenders often will have more stringent requirements than maybe we would. They are definitely looking to make sure that the borrower can pay the mortgage. And this is a practice that has worked. Otherwise, the secondary market would have blown up a long time ago. So we believe using lender qualified income is in the best interest of all parties. So this program will be testing that theory on a large scale. So again, for borrower eligibility, we're not having an approved first mortgage. The borrower will be able to pick their lender, pick their mortgage. The best practices are definitely rooted in consumer choice. So the criteria here is it does have to meet the standard of CFPB qualified mortgage. They can use it with Sharia compliant or I-10 loans. So a lot of flexibility there. Another best practice that was built into this program is the idea of fund reservation. So for many down payment programs currently, you have to have a purchase agreement before you even apply. That creates a lot of challenges along the way. And so this program, once you have completed homebuyer education, have been pre-approved for a mortgage, you then apply. And once you're approved, you have a fund reservation, and then you start your shopping for the home. So you essentially have a pre-approval for the DPA. And then once you sign a purchase agreement, you have a commitment of additional 60 days to allow for closing. The funds, use of funds are pretty standard. So one of the things that we advocate for in the best practices is that the down payment is significant enough to make a difference. So we recommend 3% of the median home price in the county. This product will allow 10% of purchase price up to $32,000. So in order to receive the full amount, the purchase price would have to be at least $320. Otherwise, it would reduce and again be based on 10% of purchase price. It's used for kind of the standard down payment assistance, so the down payment, buyer settlement costs, and principal buy down. It can be layered with other programs and take any lien position. This program, these dollars, the First Gen Community Fund, cannot be used to pay the 3.5% FHA minimum required investment, seller closing costs, or value gap. The 3.5% FHA minimum requirement, we had a training a while back on the nonprofit HUD roster. And if you remember, this requires, in order to be able to use down payment assistance, it's based on the source of funds, and the assistance has to be closed in a government entity's name, and that will not apply for the First Gen Community Fund. And so these dollars cannot cover that. There may be other dollars in the transaction that can, but it's just important to note that these dollars are not eligible for that. Repayment of funds. So in addition to creating access to home ownership, there is a secondary goal of this program, which is to help increase wealth. So it is a zero interest loan that is forgiven over 5 years. It will be forgiven 20% per year with no partial credit. There's no monthly payment. And then again, in alignment with those best practices, it does allow for resubordination if it's in the best interest of the borrower. So the most common reason that these loans will be subordinated a second time would be if a borrower is refinancing to lower their interest rate. We anticipate that to likely be happening over the next 5-year period, and do not want to lock people into high interest rates because they would have to repay any portion of a forgivable loan. And then in terms of the requirements for what makes this due, obviously they need to live in the home as their primary residence. If they were to sell the property before the 5 years, or there's any default, then the balance does become due. So what properties are eligible? So once again, it does have to be an owner-occupied principal residence. The best practices say 3 to 4 units. For a variety of reasons, this program will be 1 to 2 units. However, it can be detached townhomes, condos, co-ops, manufactured homes titled as real property, and it also can be used with any form of shared equity. So it's a great opportunity for somebody who might need to use a shared equity option to be able to afford homeownership, because as the dollars are forgiven, that is the home buyer's equity. And it does stay with them if they decide to move out of the land trust model or shared equity model into traditional homeownership. So I'm going to high level just take a look at this, review the process, and then I've got a couple more slides, and then I definitely want to open it up to questions and conversation. So I'm going to just review the process from application to closing, because while this does follow the best practices, this is new for the way in which we have done DPA, and it's a little bit of wrapping your brain around kind of this new process. So as a borrower, I determine that I meet the first generation definition. I complete my approved homebuyer education course. I have picked my lender. We have talked about the loan that is likely best for me. All of my information has been reviewed, and I have an underwritten pre-approval. Once the program launches, I, as a borrower, would go online and I would complete an application. The application is going to include some basics on household, just so that we can tell the story of who this is reaching. And then I am also going to be asked to upload my homebuyer education certificate as well as my underwritten pre-approval. The borrower will then be assigned to a DPA lender. So there are going to be about 10 DPA lenders statewide that are going to originate this product. There will not be the opportunity for borrowers to go directly to DPA lenders. We are creating an online application as a way to centralize the process. So all consumers will apply in one place, and then on the back end, they will be assigned to a DPA lender based on geography, capacity, and a variety of other things. So once the borrower is assigned to that DPA lender, they are going to verify their eligibility, and then they're going to issue a reservation letter. And it's at that point that the borrower should start shopping for a home. So again, this program is really trying to reach those that, but not for these dollars, would not have the opportunity to buy a home. So it's not going to be a fast moving process. Anybody who has a purchase agreement who applies is almost guaranteed to not receive funds. This is really for borrowers who do not have access to funds to purchase a home. And so having that reservation, having that approval once in hand, that is when they want to start shopping. Once they have a signed purchase agreement, that purchase agreement will be submitted to the DPA lender, and the DPA lender will need 35 days for closing. So that's something we're trying to let the industry know as well. This is not a quick close. This is not a, hey, I can close you in 14 days. You guys know what it takes to process these DPA loans. And so making sure that people understand it's a 35-day minimum. Once the DPA lender has received the purchase agreement, other required forms, then they will issue the commitment letter, and then the borrower moves to closing, and the DPA will, it'll be one closing. The DPA lender will prepare the closing package and wire the funds. So a little bit about, actually, I'm going to pause here before I talk a little bit about the implementation. Do people have just immediate questions, either that you want to throw in the chat or come off mute and ask? All right, I'm going to keep going. So in terms of implementation, MMCDC is the administrator. The funds were appropriated to them. They're going to manage the funds, processes, compliance, and technical assistance. one of the things that we built into the legislation was a more reasonable fee to better reflect the cost for administration and origination. So there is a split for originators and MMCDC as the administrator. And we put it in the legislation because we wanted to, again, kind of disrupt the system a little bit and acknowledge that DPA lenders cannot be essentially subsidizing this work for other entities, and they need the actual cost of what it takes to originate these products. We're also going to be, as I mentioned, testing this idea of a centralized application. All borrowers are going to be required to apply online. It's going to be a first come, first served basis, and borrowers are going to be assigned to DPA. So this is a newer process that we will be testing. We are committed to transparency. We are committed to honoring the first come, first serve, and trying to reach as many people as we can. And the other thing that we're going to be doing that will be kind of piloted in this process is this idea of standardization. So there are going to be about 10 DPA lenders statewide, and each of them are going to follow the same process, same protocol, and the same forms. So this will be an opportunity to really learn and see how we might work together collaboratively to bring something like this to scale statewide, and maybe in the future there's regional products, et cetera. But how do we have those who do this work, who are the subject matter experts on the ground, closest to community, working collectively together to standardize this experience for borrowers? So it's going to be a great learning opportunity. And I think we're going to have a lot of aha moments throughout this process. So I've got a question. Well, there'll be a one-pager breaking down first-gen questions that keep coming up around parents and legal guardians. As we move forward with marketing and outreach, we are going to be working on creating some material that's going to be focused on what is a first-generation buyer. Because again, there is a lot of confusion around that, and we want to make sure that these dollars are actually reaching first-gen buyers. So just overall, I think it's an exciting opportunity. We're going to better understand if first generation is an impactful proxy. This is really first of its kind statewide program that's operating this way. We are going to attempt to measure and see the impact of these best practices and if it will streamline the approach, and believe that buyers are going to be more prepared up front, and that we're going to see a lot more smoother closings and less deals falling apart, and more confident buyers, and hopefully help to turn around a little bit the reputation of down payment assistance and help sellers see that it can be beneficial, and with a reservation is in some ways as good as kind of having cash in hand. So the other thing I want to call out is there is this website, firstgendpa.org, and I'm going to go ahead and just pull it up really quickly. I think I'm going to have to change my sharing, but I can do that. Let's see, new share. And let's see here, how's that? I think all of you can see the website. So this is going to be the definitive source of information. When the application launches, it will be available here. We are going to be doing some work to make the homepage a little bit more simple for consumers. This is where we're going to go in much deeper around what is a first generation buyer. There's an industry page. So if any of you are interested, you can check out this mortgage lender training webinar that we did a few weeks ago that goes a little bit more in depth on the program. We have some upcoming training for realtors. We're likely to host a webinar for community partners. On here is the product terms. So all the product terms are detailed out on this website. As well as we have a brief comparison to the Minnesota Housing First Gen program. So if you really want to dig in deeper, I would encourage you to check out this website. And rather than answering questions for people that they might say, hey, have you heard, do you know? Our call to action is to really get everybody to go to the website. this will continue to be updated. It will continue to have new information as it is pertinent. It will, as we get closer to launch, it will continue to be updated. And if you haven't already, I would encourage you on the bottom of this website is to sign up to receive updates on the First Gen program. And as new information is posted on this website, then you will get a notification to come and check out the website, including when the program is going to launch. All right, so I think I did that well. All right, Zoom sharing. Okay, let's see what you guys are seeing before I go any further here. Okay, I'm gonna switch. All right. Okay, so questions and discussions. Let's open it up. I see I got a few questions in the chat that I will start with. All right. How are you? Did you select the lenders? So the DPA, so an RFP was issued by MMCDC. I think it was issued in January. It closed in February. MMCDC is in the process of working with those that they have selected for contracts and training. Joanne has a question, thinking about the potential large increase in homestretch class demand, would it be possible for us to direct people to framework training if we don't have the capacity for a large increase in the homestretch class? Great question. I would encourage them to try to register with another homestretch class. Particularly now, the program's not even available. And I know some of you on this call have seen an uptick in homebuyer education. And I think if they cannot access a homestretch class and they're on a tight timeline, framework is allowed. It's either homestretch or framework, but the hope would be, particularly with the virtual classes that are available statewide, that they might be able to register with another provider. Anybody else want to comment on the uptick in homebuyer education or have questions overall?
This is Henry. Can I say something?
Yes, Henry.
And I also asked a question about their certificate. But I would say home stretch is better if they can do it. We had 3 in February. We're having 2 in March, looking at maybe doing 2 in April. The reason why we suggest home stretch is because framework then it requires an additional one-on-one. So it's bogging down a little bit the system with our coaches trying to do one-on-ones with current clients that are in the counseling program. And then if somebody does framework, it does require, at least we require, an additional one-on-one session with that person. So it actually is adding more to the process. As they did home stretch, then they can just get that out the way, and there's no additional one-on-one requirement if they do home stretch.
And just to call out, Henry, I think that's a requirement of PPL. That's not technically a requirement of the First Gen Community Fund. And so they could go to framework home ownership and complete that without having to do a one-on-one. But it's a great point, and I agree. I think home stretch is the preferred method, particularly for first generation buyers. How long will the home stretch certificate last? 1 to 2 years. I think the home stretch requirement is that the education requirement for this program is that it has to be completed within the last year. And then for homestretch providers who are working with clients, sometimes they will issue an updated certificate with counseling, depending on how long it's been. What other questions do people have about this program?
So Brooke, this is Tanya, if you can't pay for the down payment, is that kind of where potentially the funds could be layered with the local program? To be the
You mean for like the FHA minimum required investment? Yeah, that's one use, definitely. There's nothing that says these funds can't be layered with other down payment assistance. So whatever the need or the demand, if that's a good reason, because they have to use FHA, then that would be great. With the amount of assistance, I think what we're seeing is a lot of people are going to be able to, we anticipate that people will be able to move to conventional, particularly because it's 10% of purchase price. So, but yeah, it can be layered. Our hope is that the majority of buyers will not have to layer, and that this is going to expand the number of people who get access to down payment assistance, but it is allowable.
Yeah, I just thought with, increased interest rates and all that stuff, it sort of created a different gap for people now.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
my son was looking and he was qualified when he got like a 3% thing, and now that it's 6 or whatever it is now, he has to start over again, essentially.
Right.
So
Right. What other questions do people have? Or also too, just to kind of hear from you guys, what are you guys thinking about how this might impact your down payment programs? Are you anticipating changes, or what are people thinking?
I was gonna say, I think you hit the nail on the head with depending on how people are funding things. Like the federal programs would not allow us to use just the borrower's income and have that, very specific way of having to, show income, household income. So it might impact there, and whether or not, again, whether that they'll allow that to be layered together or not, then is probably going to be an issue. So
yeah, I think that in that scenario, Tanya, they just need to qualify for your down payment. So if your down payment requires household income and they qualify, then that's you know what I mean? So it can be layered, but yeah, it is. When we started this program, we went with 10%, and this kind of anecdotal, what we were hearing is most people were layering 3 to 5 programs to reach $30,000 to $50,000. So the goal was that hopefully for the majority of buyers, this will be the only assistance they will need to be able to use, so that it will be simple and streamlined. But yeah, if they meet the criteria for your product or any other product, they certainly can apply and have access.
I think to piggyback off of that, I think people have to understand what income's being used, but also what housing ratio is being used, because there are some programs that have a minimum housing ratio.
Right. This program does not. So it would just be, how it's being layered with other programs, and the more conservative terms are going to win, I guess.
This is Jason with Neighborhoods Home Partners. I'm excited to see this at a broader scale. We have piloted a first generation program. We've closed 45 first generation loans over the last 3 years. And 85% of the buyers represented BIPOC communities. So really interested to see this work at a broader scale. And to your rhetorical question earlier, Brooke, what is will this proxy meet? Because while these funds won't count towards that 3.5%, they did originate as government funding dollars, and at this point, government funded dollars they've been hesitant to use towards special purpose credit programs. So, seeing as far as this can go, what will this proxy look like at a broader scale? And then also our pilot was limited geographically to the metro area. So looking at what would be the broader usage statewide will be really interesting to see. So I'm really excited to see what happens.
Us too, Jason. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think everyone is kind of bated breath, see what happens. And then to your point of, how the state dollars are being used, if this is not a solution to help us narrow the racial homeownership gap, then we have to make a different ask, because there has to be state investment in that work. So it'll be interesting to see. And I think a year from now, we're going to have a lot of learnings, aha moments, and a much better sense of what the impact is going to be. What are other people thinking about the upcoming product launch of this, the program itself, how it might impact what you're doing? What have you been hearing about the first gen program? Cracking up at your thinking face, Ryan.
I think it's still something that's still I think for me personally, since we're a funder versus actual, I think it's interesting to see how it plays with our programs that we currently do. I think on my side, it's something that's it's been talked about since like last year, obviously. So it's just something to see that finally that's been applied and put into practice, which is great to see. It's just a matter of now seeing it when it's actually like moving forward and being applied and being used for home buyers, because obviously with our programs, it can be layered. So it'd be important to see how that all is structured to see how it's benefiting the home buyers, especially ours that are buying a Minneapolis homes, new construction or part of our DPA program.
Yeah, great. One of the things that we heard is that people are divesting in down payment assistance because of this program, and that they're hearing arguments that local programs are not as in great of need, and just wondering if others have heard that, or if you're having to push back and make arguments for why your programs are still needed.
I can speak a bit to this from an administrator side. We partner with, I believe, 6 cities to administer down payment programs, and 2 of those 6 cities we've virtually utilized all of the funds they had set aside for their down payment program, and I'm not sure if they'll be re-upping given the other resources out there. So certainly, you know, continued conversations regarding the opportunities with the new, especially in the metro-wide sales tax, and just encouraging folks to not necessarily replace current programming with those dollars, and you know, try to increase, because you know, down payment is an important piece. But there's many other pieces that are needed in this ecosystem, and even on the home ownership side, you know, production, and there's a lot of different areas that metro-wide sales tax can go to. But that being said, there are some other cities that are continuing to invest in this, such as Ryan and Minneapolis, and others that are continuing to put dollars in this. So it's interesting to see kind of as folks think through the resources that are available. And just my personal opinion, you know, this historic $150 million first generation investment, while, you know, I personally hope that, you know, there will be a continuation at some level, you know, that there was a convergence of a historic budget surplus that allowed, I think, some of this to go through. So just wanting folks to not necessarily when they're thinking about local programs, I think this will be the end all be all forever, because this might not continue to be funded necessarily at this level. So just thinking that through will be kind of interesting, just to highlight that this isn't a replacement for local programs.
Right. And the goal is to grow the opportunity. So yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jason.
I think it'd be a little dangerous to take our foot off the gas now, especially since that was a one-time thing, and with the sales tax stuff, obviously, you know, before I left Hennepin County, I think they just got the Hennepin County stuff launched with Jason's group, and you know, the county board had already decided to set some funds aside, and we're planning to do kind of the same thing here in Anoka, is to kind of do homeownership and rental stuff with that taxpayer money. So I just feel like that's why I was asking about the layering and that kind of stuff, because not everything's going to fit everybody. And so the more we can get people into it and have the different tools in the toolbox is really important, I think. So I'm hoping, I guess, that people don't feel like they should take their foot off the gas if they got a program just because we have this money. So
yeah, that's our hope too, Tanya. Thank you for that. All right, any other burning questions? I can take time to answer any questions about the product terms if anybody has a question about that, or about our process, or any of this. So all right. So I'll just pull up here. We have our next meeting scheduled. And so that is scheduled for June 13th. And during this webinar, we're going to focus a little bit and hear from peers about ways to build support for funding and how to convey the impact for consumers